Welcome to One Spark at a Time with Rabbi Miller. A Jewish mystical legend tells that at the beginning of creation, the world was perfect. The divine essence rested in sacred vessels until one day those vessels cracked and shattered, scattering sparks of holiness all over the world. It is now our responsibility and mission to do acts of tikkun olam, repairing the broken world around us. Each time we do a good deed, we are gathering one more of those sparks, making our world a little more whole and holy. Today, I am joined by a woman who's doing this sacred work of repairing the world one spark at a time. Our guest today is Linda Oberhaus, the CEO at the Naples Shelter for Abused Women and Children. Linda has more than 30 years of professional experience in the human services field. In 2007, she joined the shelter, where the mission is leading and collaborating with the community to prevent, protect, and prevail over domestic violence and human trafficking through advocacy, empowerment, and social change. Linda, welcome to One Spark at a Time.
Hi, good morning, Rabbi Miller.
Good morning. It's a delight to have you here. You are such a remarkable individual. And I have to start with the most obvious question. How are you right now?
Well, sheltering in place ordinarily like everyone else, but we're doing just fine here at the shelter.
I'm glad to hear that, and I look forward to learning more from you today about the shelter, as does all of our audience. You've spent 30 years in the field of human services. That's a remarkable time spent helping other people. I imagine that if you were asked as a child to name your future career, that might not have been on the radar. When did you know that this was going to be your calling?
Well, in high school, I was a peer counselor. So I started out as a social worker, I suppose, at an early age.
What started you in that work of being a peer counselor?
There were kids in school who were having difficulties, and when they were looking for students who could be supportive, I just stepped up and volunteered.
Often there's an influential person or event that helps us find a calling like that to help others. Was there someone or something that played that role in your life?
Um, the most influential person for me would have been my grandmother. So she was just, she was wise, and she was a great role model.
So she was clearly an inspiration. Having started off as a peer counselor and then deciding to move into this field, were there obstacles that you encountered along the way?
Well, when I was graduating from high school, 18 years old, I you figure I turned 18 and graduated high school in June. And then my mother moved back to Massachusetts from Florida
Oh
in
my.
August. So within about 2 months of officially becoming an adult and graduating high school, I was pretty much on my own. So I learned a lot during that time. I think that was probably the one most influential moment in my life. Mm-hmm.
That had to be quite a jarring experience. So suddenly be thrust into the role of being an adult on your own.
Actually, I think that was that grit, and really pushed me to do the best I could do, and be the best person I could be.
I imagine it did push you in that way. So professionally, you started in high school as a peer counselor. You went to college. Where did your professional career begin?
So I started out at 18 working in a group home for the developmentally disabled. And then shortly after that, I worked at a community mental health center. So I did that for a little over 6 years. And while I was working at the community mental health center, I worked for an inpatient psychiatric unit as well.
My goodness, that must have, to be thrown into those different situations and environments, that must have been quite emotionally taxing to be in those different settings and have people relying upon you in those situations.
Well, I learned a lot about compassion. I learned a lot. I saw a lot. Um, those types of things, they have a way of helping you grow up.
I imagine they do. You talk about compassion being an important value. How has your faith or your values helped shape your journey along this path?
Um, well, as a social worker, our values are, to treat everyone with dignity and respect. And certainly that goes a long way in this field of domestic violence, as it did back in the days when I was doing community mental health.
I'm sure that it did. What drew you then to Naples, Florida, and specifically to the Shelter for Abused Women and Children?
So at that time, back in 2007, I was the CEO of the Domestic Violence Center in Tampa. And I was called to interview for the position here in Naples. And I was familiar with this center and this community. And it really, this domestic violence center had glowing reviews, from around the state of Florida. And, as being a really good domestic violence center. Yeah.
I'm sure that's heartening to those who were part of creating the shelter here to know the reputation that it had before you arrived. But I also know from being involved with the shelter over the years that it's transformed dramatically during your tenure there. Can you share with us, while we know it today to be the pillar of our Southwest Florida community, how has it grown during your time?
So since I came to Naples in 2007, some of the expansions have been our transitional living program. So we have cottages where families can stay for up to 2 years when they leave the shelter. So, and they're sort of scattered. So we have 9 of those cottages now. We've expanded our prevention programming, and with the collaboration with the school system, we're in the elementary, the middle, and the high schools. And then more recently have through the Florida Department of Education, are expanding our human trafficking education for grades kindergarten through 12th, if you can imagine. But it's really just an effort to help keep our kids safe.
That education component is so important, especially beginning at an early age. You mentioned the stay up to 2 years. What's the average stay for someone who comes to the shelter?
So in our emergency shelter, it's about 6 weeks. Although, we've had people come to our shelter and just be here for a night or two and say, the shelter really saved my life. And then on the other hand, we've had someone stay in our shelter, for 8 to 12 months. But really 6 weeks is the average that a family would stay with us.
So I know this is not just about numbers, but to help our audience appreciate the impact that the shelter has, can you tell us how many lives have been positively impacted by the work that you're doing, and whether it's over time or in a particular period of time? Give us a sense of how many individuals and families are touched by the work of the shelter.
Many thousands of individuals. If you think about just the prevention programming and all of the kids that we impact in the schools. Not everyone who needs support for domestic violence necessarily comes through our emergency shelter. So where we might see about 500 people a year coming through our emergency shelter, we see thousands through our, counseling, safety planning. We receive about 1,500 calls to our crisis hotline every year. So, I think that we touch a lot of lives here in Collier County.
I know you touch a number of lives, and it's hard to even wrap our minds around some of those numbers to realize the thousands that are helped every year by the services offered by the shelter, in addition to those who are staying there. But it's more than just the numbers. So help us understand some of the people who are there. I'm sure that there have been many powerful and likely heartbreaking stories that have been part of your experience there. Can you share one or two of those with us so we can meet some of the people who have been touched by the shelter?
Sure, sure. One particular instant comes to mind, and that is I was at an event with my daughter. She was, probably 14 at the time, maybe younger than that, maybe 13. And as we were leaving the event, we had to pass the shelter to go home. And she said, Mommy, can we go to the shelter so I can see the pets? Because we have a kennel where we shelter the pets. And so as I opened the kennel door, there was a victim sitting in the room, and unexpectedly, and she had noticeably been battered to the point where she had like a huge black eye. It looked like a golf ball on her eye. Now, I had been working in the field for many years, so I'm obviously very familiar with the abuse of victims. Of course, my daughter at the time, she knew the kind of work that I did, but she had never, she knew I went to work every day, and she knew that I worked at a shelter every day, but I think it was sort of a turning point for her, that moment in time where she realized exactly what I was doing when I went to work. So she, she was able to interact. The woman was in there visiting with her small dog in the kennel, and my daughter was fairly quiet, just interacting with the pets. And then when we got outside, it was a pretty emotional moment. She was pretty sad. She was crying a lot, and she just said, Mom, I finally get it. Like, I understand what it is that you do every day. So that it was just kind of interesting. And, today she's working in a domestic violence center herself.
Oh, is she really?
She
Oh,
is.
wow.
Yeah.
As a parent, that had to be such an emotional moment for you to see that kind of wash over her as she realized the power and the impact. For the other parents who might be listening to this, or even grandparents, how do you even engage in that kind of conversation with a teenager to let them know about the reality of some of the challenges that are out there in the world?
Well, I think just to be honest with our young people about the fact that not every home is a safe home. We talk in terms of healthy relationships a fair amount, respect in relationships, for example. Maybe talk to our kids about the warning signs of an abusive relationship. I just think it's so very important.
It is, especially to start those conversations, I imagine. Yeah, I know that as a successful social enterprise, it's not just about providing services, but also engaging the larger community. And that can be challenging when the topic is one that people might feel is taboo. So they're reluctant to talk about it or even accept that it's happening in their community, much less in their families. Tell us how the shelter has managed to engage this community here in Southwest Florida around the subject of domestic violence.
One of the things that we did several years ago, and this was on the heels of, I had a women's group come in, and obviously I had given a presentation on domestic violence, and I referred to domestic violence as an epidemic. And the group said, well, certainly not in our community. They were from a specific area within the community. And I said, absolutely, domestic violence is happening in your community. And that really was the day that we decided to do a collaboration with all three law enforcement agencies in mapping out where are these 911 calls coming from. Actually, I can give you a visual of it here. So this is what the 911 calls look like here in Collier County, with Immokalee being up here, Marco Island being down here. We have Golden Gate here in East Naples. So you can see that literally these 911 calls are coming from all over the community.
For anyone who's listening to this as a podcast, the map is covered in black dots. They are everywhere, all across Southwest Florida, from Immokalee down to Marco. There is no area that is without a significant number of 911 calls coming in related to domestic violence.
So this is a 1 year snapshot. So you figure 1,611 calls to 911. And what's so interesting about this is that we know in the field that the large majority of victims never call the police for help. You could actually put a magnifier on this and actually double or even triple the number of dots that are on this map. And if you think about the fact that for each dot on this map, there may be children living in the home who may be exposed to that violence as well. So we know that domestic violence is generational. And so people who are exposed, children who are exposed to domestic violence, boys are twice as likely to become abusers themselves, and girls are more likely to become victims. Even though we know that boys can be victims and girls can be abusers, I think for the most part, what we're seeing is violence against women and girls.
Yeah. Well, talk about that for a moment, though. You touched on something that I think a lot of people have as one of their myths about domestic violence, that it is only women and children who are the victims, but men are also a part of that. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Sure. Um, Domestic violence, and we say it like breast cancer, for example. When people think about breast cancer, they typically think about women, but men get breast cancer as well. They just don't get it, to the same extent or the same rate that women do. So similarly, men can be victims of domestic violence, and certainly are. And so we shelter not only women and children, but we also shelter men who are victims of both domestic violence and human trafficking.
So that's a great segue to our next piece. Knowing that there's more to be done, not only is the shelter about domestic violence, which I think many people would readily connect it to, but you also have mentioned human trafficking. Share with our audience how these two are connected and why this is so important for the shelter to be making human trafficking a priority at this time.
So what we have been seeing here, and we've been serving victims of domestic violence and human trafficking since before my time, back in 2007. Although the human trafficking seemed like it was more international victims that we were seeing
Hmm.
in recent years, and I would say, gosh, maybe 6 or 7 years, it's been primarily local victims, U.S. born, as victims of human trafficking. And so sometimes when I talk to people about human trafficking, I'll mention the movie Taken, because people are familiar with that movie. Many people have seen it. It's a movie on human trafficking. But the reality is that human trafficking victims, they're chosen. And there's also a documentary film called Chosen, because
Okay.
traffickers, that's what they do. They're not really stealing. And it doesn't mean that victims are never kidnapped. We know that certainly happens, but the large majority of victims are actually chosen by the trafficker. And so
What does that
um,
mean, chosen?
chosen means traffickers. And if you it, traffickers actually they look for vulnerabilities in the people that they're choosing to traffic. So, for example, um, kids who are in the child welfare system, kids who are in foster care, for example, they tend to be vulnerable targets for traffickers because they've already been, many of them, exploited, they've been abused, in some cases sexually abused. And so in some ways these are broken children, and so the traffickers will actually target them in order to traffic them. But here in Naples, I have seen another class of sex trafficking victims, and that is local victims of human trafficking who come from good homes, they come from good neighborhoods, and who would never believe in a million years that someone would attempt to sell them. And so they're just loving girls who happen to be naive about those things happening. It just would never occur to them, and so they too can become vulnerable to traffickers.
How do they get tangled up in that web?
So one example I'll give you, and her story has been publicized. I call her Sarah, and so I'll just give you an example of a local girl. So she came from a good home. Her parents are still married. She was attending FSW. She was attending college, and she and her friends went to a party one evening, and there was a trafficker at this party. Now, he was well known to the Collier County Sheriff's Office as a trafficker, but she didn't know that. And so he quickly befriended her. And
Mm.
I remember when she told me her story, I remember thinking, I know how he got her, because she was so loving and so sweet, and she had this innocent way about her. And as she was telling me her story, and trafficking, sex trafficking in particular, has a lot of seediness to it. And she stopped in the middle of her story and she said, Linda, I want you to know that I am a good person. And the thing was, I already knew that. I could
Yeah.
tell she was a good person.
Oh,
And then at the very end, she said, thank you for believing me.
oh
So,
my goodness.
Yeah, and she was the one who helped me really understand the distinction between the vulnerabilities that girls in particular have who are trafficked. Those who have been abused, and that's used against them as a vulnerability, and girls who have not, girls that have come from good homes, who maybe are loving and naive, that anyone would ever commit these kind of crimes.
Oh, that is just a heartbreaking story to realize how she perceived herself as being somehow flawed and just needed you to listen to her and hear her story and believe her. How do we get past human trafficking? How do we educate our students and our children so that they won't be victims in the future?
Well, if you think about, our messages around stranger danger, for example, I think that that's one way to approach the issue. It really kind of depends. The messages need to be age appropriate, obviously. But, I think that if we're ever really going to stop human trafficking, I think that the buyers need to stop buying. And if buyers were not buying women and girls, then trafficking wouldn't exist. There was a time when there was a lot of talk around, we have to put the traffickers out of business. And then I thought to myself, well, who's creating the demand for the traffickers? I mean,
Mhm.
for these victims, and it's actually the buyers. And so I think that maybe tougher penalties on people who choose to buy women and girls and children and sometimes boys for sex. I think there needs to be tougher penalties on that.
And in the last couple of years, not only have you shifted it toward on the focus and energy on addressing this issue of domestic human trafficking, but you've also broadened the scope beyond just the shelter that's here in Naples to resources in Immokalee. Tell us about that effort and what sparked that.
Sure. So we did a study in Immokalee where we surveyed members of the community, the people that we were serving out of our outreach office, and we were looking at, what are the biggest concerns in this rural farm working community. And among the top concerns was violence in the home and domestic violence in particular. So after we went through the study and realized there was a huge need in that community, and that these victims who live in Immokalee, they were not coming to Naples to be sheltered for a variety of reasons.
Mm.
Their kids were in school or daycare in Immokalee, their jobs were in Immokalee, their entire support systems. So they had very good reasons for not coming into Naples to be sheltered. And so as we were designing a plan to build a shelter in Immokalee, we decided, wouldn't it be great if we had a specialized wing where we could house all the victims of human trafficking to be able to provide them with the specialized services and the care that they need. And that's what we have now. The facility is actually built. When
Fantastic.
when the stay thank you when the stay-at-home order was put into place, we were just about ready to do the grand opening. So the shelter is ready to be open just as soon as the governor lifts the stay-at-home order, and then we'll be open for business and ready to shelter the families that need it from that community.
Well, that's a wonderful opportunity for us to segue when you bring up the stay-at-home order, and certainly on all of our minds right now is the COVID-19 pandemic. How has this situation, the stay-at-home order, and just the challenges we're facing right now, impacted the work of the shelter, and how have you responded to those challenges?
So, our big priority is to ensure that we're keeping everyone safe. One of the ways that we've pitched it to the media and to the larger community is that, the shelter is a safe place from abuse, but it's also a safe place during a pandemic. And so we're doing everything we can to ensure that the shelter is sanitized, every 2 hours, sanitizing. Our facility staff are considered essential staff, here ensuring that, the shelter is clean. We're asking questions during the intake process that we hadn't asked before.
Mm.
So that way, if anyone needs to be isolated, they certainly can be. But important to note is that we don't have any active cases of the coronavirus among staff or the people we serve. When we were speaking earlier, prior to the webinar, we were
Mhm.
talking about the fact that calls to our crisis hotline are down, and they're down by close to 50%, the calls to our hotline.
And what do you attribute that to?
Um, I when when the governor issued the stay-at-home order, he essentially ordered, all victims to be sheltered in place with their abusers. And so these victims are not in a position to be calling our hotline. If they're sheltering in place with their abuser 24 hours a day, there may not be a good time or even a safe time for those victims to call our hotline. So we suspect there's going to be a surge of calls and people needing to access our services once that stay-at-home order is lifted.
I can understand why that would be an expectation to have that surge coming. For anyone who might be listening to this or watching this who is in a difficult relationship, who might know of someone who is in an abusive relationship, do you have any suggestions for what they might be able to do to get help now and not have to wait until after the stay-at-home order is lifted?
One of the things we're working on with our team members is putting a texting app in place in order for victims to be able to text us and be able to get the help that they need. I would say, domestic violence, as you know, can be very dangerous and in some cases deadly. And so I would encourage victims to call 911 if they're in a serious situation and they need assistance getting out of the home or getting to the shelter. Law enforcement, they're our close partners, and they'll support and assist them.
I know you shared with me and others before, and some of them might be familiar with it. How can they make 911 work? I know there's some stories out there of people who've been able to connect to 911 even in the room when they're with someone who has been abusive to them. How might you recommend they go about that in a way that is protective of their own safety?
So in some cases, a victim will call 911 and not be direct about the fact that they need help. The good thing about 911 is that when a victim calls 911, law enforcement, they are required to show up on scene. So even if it's a misdial, even if whoever from the home called and they didn't mean to call, and law enforcement will need to see whoever's in the home. So even if they dial 911 and set the phone down and that's the safest thing they can do, law enforcement will arrive at their home.
That's an important resource for us to have in the community. And I think it speaks to the relationship that you've established as the shelter with our law enforcement. Thinking about the current obstacles and recognizing that someday, we don't know when, but someday this will pass. Looking ahead, what do you see as the future vision for the shelter, and how do you hope to continue improving lives and repairing the brokenness around us?
Well, that's a big question. I think that education is power. I think that we need to continue educating our young people. I think that we need to continue to work toward breaking the cycle of abuse, whether it's domestic violence or human trafficking. We're all about keeping victims safe and ensuring that perpetrators are held accountable. And I think that's really important because what we find with abusers is that they tend to move on and they go from one victim to another. And domestic violence is not something that just happens. It's something that slowly sort of happens over time. And, because if someone ever got hit on the first date, they would never date abusers. Abusers would never get dated. So that's really not how that happens. But I'll share with you an analogy, and it's an analogy that a survivor who works closely with us shares a fair amount. And she says, if you take a frog and you put that frog in boiling water, it'll jump right out. But if you take a frog, you put it in water and you slowly turn up the heat, it will literally stay there until it dies. And so that's what happens in domestic violence relationships, is that the abuse slowly happens until it's like right there, and could potentially be lethal, as I mentioned earlier.
It's a powerful analogy, and one that will have many of us thinking about how relationships, it's not so black and white at the beginning. It's more hidden and insidious, and that's a dangerous thing. I have to ask a question for our listeners. You have so much energy and passion to continue doing this work after 30 years. What is it that gets you up in the morning? What is it that moves you?
Every one of these women and children in the shelter, they do. And so for many members of our community, they might think, wow, it's such a sad thing that all of these women and children are in the shelter. But the reality is they are all here and they are all safe. And so, and the shelter actually is a happy place. In spite of the fact that we serve victims of domestic violence and human trafficking, knowing that I walk through the doors every day and our shelter is full of people who have been liberated from violence, that's what gets me up every day.
It's a wonderful thing to know that you're doing that for those people and changing their lives in such a positive way. One more question before we transition over and see if anyone in our audience would like to ask questions. And for those who are on the webinar, you can do so by going to the Q&A tab and typing in your questions. I'm like to know, Linda, if you think about it now, and I know you have many more years ahead of you at the shelter, God willing, but right now, what would you see as the thing you're most proud of in the work that you have done to heal our world?
Breaking the cycle of abuse for so many of the families that we've served, for all of those children, and there are thousands and thousands of children who have come through our doors, not only of this shelter, but shelters all over the country. These children are watching, and I think you know that, and I think all members of our community, they know that children are watching and they see what's happening. And so for a victim to have that kind of courage, and we'd like to refer to them as survivors, to have that kind of courage to break the cycle of abuse and demonstrate that for their children, that violence in the home is not okay, I think it sends a strong message to kids, and they're less likely to be the next generation of victims or abusers.
Thank you for that powerful note to transition us. One of our viewers like to know, how can those who are listening today and learning about your amazing work be helpful for the shelter?
So volunteering is a way that that folks often, give back to the shelter. And I mean, there are so many different ways that people can volunteer for us. Some people want to work on the front lines, so they'll go through an intensive domestic violence course to be able to answer the hotline, for example. But then I have other volunteers who say, I would never want to answer that hotline, but I'll do it. I'll do anything else that you have. So those volunteers, they might work in our administrative office, or they might work at our options thrift shop. And really, we would not be able to do, a large fraction of what we do if it were not for our volunteers. And so members of the community can just go to our website, and there's a link that you can click on to become a volunteer, enter their information, and we can get them going right after the stay-at-home order's lifted.
Okay, that we will wait till after the stay at home, but that is wonderful that they can volunteer in that way. Another question has come in. How has technology impacted the work of the shelter, knowing that we are now in a more digital virtual world? Has the shelter been able to use that technology as well?
We have, and it's possible that we've been able to reach victims now during the pandemic that we might never have been able to reach, because we know that many victims won't come into the shelter for a number of reasons. Shame is one among them, but they might be willing to talk to an advocate over the phone, maybe do some video conferencing. I think that technology is going to play a huge role in how we do our work. It doesn't always have to be face to face, and some victims might be more comfortable getting the services they need by phone instead of in person, and we're happy to do that.
It's good to know the technology is helpful. It looks like one more question. For someone who thinks that a friend or family member is in an abusive relationship, how would you recommend they approach that person about that?
Well, I'll answer that question this way. So oftentimes I think that we're very quick to encourage victims to leave. But what we all need to realize is when a victim leaves, that can be the most dangerous time. In fact, if a victim is more likely to be killed at the point when she's leaving or has already left that relationship. And so I would answer that question by saying, rather than encourage that victim to leave, because it can be so dangerous to do that, is to encourage them to call the 24-hour crisis hotline. And we have staff 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, answering the calls for victims. So we're here when victims need us.
So the recommendation is encourage them to call the hotline. Don't feel they have to take on the task of moving them forward by themselves.
Yeah, yeah, and we have staff that are trained and can help them safety plan and be able to leave the home safely.
Those plans are critical for helping people get out in a safe manner. A final question. You've embraced a life and a career of helping others, putting service to others and repairing our broken world as priorities. What would you say to those who are watching or listening, who themselves might see an area of need, perhaps another part of our world that's broken, but are unsure about what to do to take that leap into action?
Hmm. Um, well, you just have to take the first step.
Take the first step. Well, I think clearly you've
Like,
taken many more than
just
just the
I
first
would
step.
and do whatever you
Oh,
can.
you broke up there for a moment, Lynn. If you could, you said take the first step and then we lost you for a moment.
Jump right in.
Oh, we lost you there for a moment. Linda, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, we lost you for a moment. As you started to answer the question, you froze for us on our feed. If you could start if you don't mind answering the question again, what you said, take that first step, and then we lost you for which that first step is an important step. And clearly you've taken many more than just the first step. But beyond taking the first step, what else would you encourage them to do?
Well, I would say, everyone can do something. And so if you see a need, take that first step and jump right in, and offer a helping hand.
Wonderful. Well, Linda, thank you so much for being with me today, for being a part of this One Spark experience, for sharing your story and the incredible work of the Naples Shelter for Abused Women and Children. I want to give you a moment. It's because of this time of COVID-19, when many of us are looking for ways to give back to the community. You mentioned it before, volunteering. We're giving opportunity for our guests to share and also to identify. We are also identifying some local organizations who have opportunities. Are there other ways that you'd encourage people right now during the pandemic that they can give back to the shelter?
So, well, this afternoon I'll be meeting with our Next Generation Committee, and this is a group of young professionals who support the organization. We are going to be doing a Stock the Shelter event, and that's for our new shelter. And so essentially what they're going to be doing is putting out to the community a way for community members to do even just that one thing. It might be to buy diapers or formula or like a baby blanket, but we'll have all of the items up there that the new shelter needs, and members of the community can click on even just one item and purchase one item for the shelter. And can you imagine if everyone in the community clicked on one item, we would literally stock that entire shelter.
That's phenomenal. Where do they have to go to click? Is that just on the Naples Shelter website?
It will be soon. We're going to be videotaping that segment tonight, and then we'll blast it out to the community. So I'll make sure that you and you and all of your members have access to that information.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. Another organization that we're spotlighting this week is the Cafe of Life, which is located in Bonita Springs and began first as a coffee place and a place to prepare meals for those who are underprivileged and in need and facing food insecurity. Right now, the Cafe of Life is bringing meals to people unable to host them, and they are looking for volunteers to be present in the building to help prepare some meals, to help with some office things. If you can give of your time and energy in a safe environment, we encourage you to reach out to the Cafe of Life, which again is located in Bonita Springs, for those who are able to volunteer their time to help address these challenges that we're all facing right now during this COVID-19 pandemic. Linda, thank you again for joining me today.
Thank you, Rabbi Miller.
And thank you to all those who are in our audience, who are watching or listening to One Spark at a Time with me, Rabbi Adam Miller. If you missed any part of this experience today or want to watch other episodes, the full video will be available on the Temple Shalom of Naples YouTube channel. You can also subscribe to the One Spark at a Time podcast, available on your favorite podcast provider. Friends, as we part ways today, may you be inspired to change the world. Know that you too have the power to fix the brokenness that you see, one spark at a time.